On this road trip, our family visited some important places to learn about American Civil War. Let's begin by sharing to you Harper's Ferry. We're taking a bus going to Harper's Ferry. Before we get to Harper's Ferry, which is a little town in West Virginia, let me share to you a little bit about the political or national atmosphere around these times. In the 1820s, the industry was developing at a fast pace in the north, while farming plantations were thriving in the south. Cash crops had long been profitable in the south due to the labors provided by the enslaved people, who were actually third and fourth generation Americans whose ancestry mostly came from Africa. By 1850s, the tension between the North and the South reached a boiling point over the issue of slavery. Most Northerners saw slavery as incompatible with a free society. On the other hand, Southerners felt that their right to choose as an independent state is being threatened by the federal government. Okay, we're here at Harper's Ferry. Look at the original railroads from the 1800s. There's the town. We're gonna check out the buildings, the quarters, stores, maybe museums. So let me share to you what actually happened here at Harper's Ferry in the American history that have contributed to the bitter sentiments between the North and the South over the issue of slavery. On October 16, 1859, an abolitionist named John Brown led a small band of men to raid the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. John Brown trained a 21-man army to capture the arsenal and then held hostage slave owners, including Colonel Lewis Washington, as they armed their slaves with pikes and rifles. However, the rebellion was quickly stopped by the U.S. Marines under the command of Colonel Robert Lee. Many raiders died in this incident, and John Brown and 6 others were later tried, convicted, and executed on December 2nd, 1859. We are now inside one of the military quarters. This is the officers' quarters. The rebels and the army.
Visited Kennedy Farm under the cover of darkness to avoid the suspicion of neighbors. John Brown's daughter Annie and daughter-in-law Martha helped portray a typical domestic scene.
I was there to keep the outside world from discovering that John Brown and his men were in their neighborhood.
Quick, to the attic.
Sometimes Mrs. Huckmaster would have brood of little ones with these.
We sure have a better fall season here in West Virginia. The weather is cooler and the trees and leaves are just so colorful. have a lot of nice restaurants and small shops around here. By the way, after the incident, to the north, John Brown was held as a martyr to the cause of freedom, while the Southerners feared that the event signifies that the North were being controlled and influenced by the abolitionists. I think that's the bridge that goes to Maryland Heights over the Potomac River. Now we're looking for a place to eat. We found a nice place. Well, that's Harper's Ferry. Our next stop is Fort Sumter in South Carolina, where the Civil War began. Fort Sumter is situated on an island at the Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. We're here at the Visitor Center, just waiting for our ferry boat. And we're just enjoying the sun because it's a little bit chilly here in Charleston. Okay, let's go check out their museum. Let's read this. This says, "The first shot, what brought the nation to civil war at Fort Sumter." Needless to say, today we will be learning how the American Civil War began. There's our ferry boat.
Very pleased to have it here. Also, you might see it's animal bottomless dolphins. They're near shore dolphins, and if we see them, we will talk about to you. What you learn is when you're giving these talks is that if a dolphin shows up, you can set yourself on fire and notice.
So let's continue with our history lesson on how the Civil War began. On the year 1860, the anti-slavery Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln won the presidential election. On December 20, 1860, South Carolina, a pro-slavery state, was first to secede from the Union. The survival of America as a unified nation was in doubt. And by March 1861, a total of 7 states seceded from the Union and formed a new country named the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as president. There's Fort Sumter. We're inside the fort. Since South Carolina seceded from the Union, South Carolina Governor Pickens has been demanding the Union to surrender the federally controlled Fort Sumter to the state of South Carolina. But repeatedly, his demands were ignored. On Thursday, April 11, 1861, Confederate Army General Beauregard sent 3 of his officers to Fort Sumter to once again demand its surrender. But Major Anderson, who was in charge of Fort Sumter, once again refused and declined. In the early spring of 1861, Major Robert Anderson and his officers requested for more supplies and more men for Fort Sumter. Newly elected President Abraham Lincoln, after realizing that Anderson's command would run out of food by April 15, 1861, immediately ordered a fleet of ships to enter into Charleston Harbor to bring in the supply. Confederate leaders decided that the fleet sent to the harbor was an act of war. So once again, Confederate leaders ordered the Federals to surrender the fort. But when Major Anderson refused, Confederate cannons opened fire at the fort on April 12, 1861. This was known as the first shot of the American Civil War. Confederate cannons fired 3,341 shells at the fort over the course of 34 hours. And on the next day, Saturday, April the 13th, the Federals finally took down the American flag and the fort was surrendered and evacuated. Fort Sumter remained in the hands of the Confederacy until the end of the Civil War. Now we're checking out the museum inside the fort. Oh, check out the nice replica of the fort. So this is like the bird's eye view. Nice. And on April 14, 1865, a widely announced end-of-war celebration took place at Fort Sumter. After 4 years, the now Major General Anderson, though ill and retired, attended the ceremony and raised the flag. However, the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, which occurred on the evening of that date, almost immediately overshadowed the festivities. We're heading back to our ferry boat. Well, that's the history of Fort Sumter here in South Carolina. Our next stop, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The Battle of Gettysburg is also known as the turning point in the American Civil War. We are now here at Gettysburg Museum and Visitor Center. We're planning to watch their popular cyclorama first. Hey look, Abraham Lincoln is there sitting alone. kids are trying to donate. General Robert E. Lee was the top general of the Southern States Confederate Army. By 1863, the Southern Territory is composed of 11 states that seceded from the original 33. We are now at the Gettysburg National Military Park doing our own tour. And this right here is called the Eternal Light Peace Memorial. From 1861 to 1863, the Confederate Army in the East repeatedly stopped the Union's effort to capture Richmond, which is the capital of the Confederate States of America. So many Northerners had come to feel that further fighting was useless since the North had made no headway. A Union General, Ulysses S. Grant, had emerged from obscurity in 1862 to capture Forts Henry and Donelson in Tennessee and Kentucky. But Grant's army was driven back in December 1862 when he tried to take Vicksburg in Mississippi. General Lee of the Confederate Army decided to bring the fight to the North, not only to save the farmlands of the South, but also to get the supplies the military needed. General Lee also strategically believed that the fight to the North would force the Union Army to move away from Vicksburg. And on July 1st, 1863, the two armies converged between General Robert Lee and General George Meade at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Thus began the three-day Battle of Gettysburg. On the first 2 days, the Confederates won their battles, for they had more men and pushed the Union troops south of the town, where they clung to high ground. On the third day, Lee felt that one more attack at Gettysburg would give the South the victory they needed. So late on the third day, the Confederate marched towards the Union Army, led by General George Pickett. They were heard calling the rebel yell as they charged straight towards the Union's cannon and musket fire. By nightfall, many of the rebels were killed. The Confederate Army were defeated. The great attack known as Pickett's Charge was over, and so was the South's invasion of the North. The next day, July 4th, 1863, General Lee led the battered troops back to Virginia. The carnage at Gettysburg cost 28,000 Confederate lives. The dispirited General Lee offered his resignation to Jefferson Davis, who refused to accept it. 6 weeks later, the Confederates surrendered at Vicksburg. The defeat at Gettysburg and Vicksburg were too great of a loss for the South to recover. In November of 1863, President Lincoln spoke at the dedication of the Gettysburg Battlefield Cemetery. His powerful Gettysburg address referred to the suffering and deaths of all American soldiers as a commitment to the principles of the equality of all men, a nation under God, and reaffirmation to the American democracy. And on April 9, 1865, Confederate General Robert Lee surrendered his Army of Northern Virginia, marking a symbolic end to the Civil War. And that, folks, is a short summary of the Battle of Gettysburg. Now let's go to our final stop at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., where President Lincoln was assassinated. On the night of April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated while attending a play at Ford Theater in Washington, D.C. The assassin, actor John Wilkes Booth. I like their museum here. You really learn a lot about Abraham Lincoln's accomplishments. John Wilkes Booth, a well known actor and Southern sympathizer, saw Lincoln as the source of the South's problems. John Booth, like many Southerners, believed that Abraham Lincoln is being controlled by the abolitionists, and John Booth despised the abolitionists. In the late 1864, he began laying plans to kidnap the president. His early recruits were Samuel Arnold, Michael O'Laughlin, John Surratt, and his mother, Mary Surratt. By 1865, he added more conspirators, David Harold, George Atzerodt, and Lewis Powell. But their attempt to kidnap and seize Lincoln on March 17, 1865, failed. On the morning of April 14, 1865, Booth, who was still distraught over the collapse of the Confederacy and their failed kidnapping, learned that the president would be attending a comedy performance at Ford's Theater. This is the night John Booth decided to assassinate the president himself. At about 8:30 p.m., the Lincolns and their guest, Major Rathbone and Clara Harris, arrived at Ford's Theater and sat at the presidential box. At about 10:15 p.m., when only one actor, Harry Hawk, was on the stage and the audience was laughing, John Wilkes Booth entered the presidential box. Booth then shot Lincoln on the left side of his head, dropped his pistol, and waved the dagger. Major Rathbone lunged at Booth, and though slashed in the arm, forced the killer to the railing. Booth then leaped from the balcony, but his left boot got entangled on a flag draped over the rail and broke a bone in his leg on landing. And though injured, Booth rushed out of the back door and disappeared into the night on horseback. A doctor in the audience, Dr. Charles Leo, immediately went upstairs to the box. The bullet had entered through Lincoln's left ear and lodged behind his right eye. He was paralyzed and barely breathing. He was carried across 10th Street to a boarding house opposite the theater, but the doctor's best efforts failed. 9 hours later, at 7:22 a.m. on April 15th, Lincoln died. This is the room and the bed where Abraham Lincoln died. Booth was eventually shot and captured while hiding in a barn near Bowling Green, Virginia. Booth died later the same day, April 26, 1865. The other conspirators were also arrested and sent to prison. And the four co-conspirators, namely Powell, Atzerodt, Harold, and Mary Surratt, were hanged at the gallows of the old penitentiary on July 7, 1865. Abraham Lincoln's coffin took a funeral train and left Washington, D.C. on April 21, 1865. The funeral train went through 6 states: Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Ohio, and Indiana. America mourned for 3 weeks, And after 20 days, on May 1st, 1865, Abraham Lincoln's body was laid to rest at Oak Ridge Cemetery, Springfield, Illinois. Abraham Lincoln is considered by most historians to be one of America's greatest presidents. His legacy includes winning the war against the South and guiding America through the trauma of Civil War. His issuance of Emancipation Proclamation led to the end of slavery, and his famous Gettysburg Address affirmed America's commitment to the principles of human equality, Constitution, and democracy. Well, thanks for joining us on our history road trip to learn about the American Civil War. Hope to see you again in our next Negosa Family Making Memories videos. God bless.